I'm Joe Arnold, president of the Louisville Forum, and welcome to our November 2022 meeting. We meet on the second Wednesday of every month at Vincenzo's downtown. All are welcome. Founded in 1984, the Louisville Forum is a nonpartisan public issues group that hosts debates and discussions of contemporary and sometimes controversial public policy issues that affect the greater Louisville community. For more information on the Louisville Forum, our programs, or to make reservations, please visit louisvilleforum.org. Well, even though votes are still being counted in other states, we do know the results of the midterm elections in Kentucky. Democrat Craig Greenberg won the Louisville mayor's race. Democrat Morgan McGarvey won the 3rd Congressional District. All other members of Congress in Kentucky are Republican, including Rand Paul, who won his 3rd term. Nationally, I don't think we know yet which party will control either house of Congress. In the Kentucky House, and thanks in part to 3 Jefferson County House seats flipping Republican, Republicans increased their supermajority from 75 to 80 or maybe 81 seats. In the Senate in Frankfort, Republicans now have a 31-7 supermajority. Both constitutional amendments on the ballot failed, and now we go to our instant panel. Lawrence Smith, longtime television journalist, veteran of many elections. He is now communications director for the Kentucky Baptist Convention, where he serves as executive editor of Kentucky Today. Morgan Watkins is the chief political reporter at the Courier-Journal, where she has worked since 2016. She covers politics, state government, and Kentucky's congressional delegation. She also previously covered the University of Louisville and higher education for the CJ's newsroom. On my far left, since 2014, Jacqueline Pitts has served as creator and managing editor of The Bottom Line, the news site of the Kentucky Chamber, where she is now, congratulations, Senior Vice President of Communications and Marketing. And our moderator today is none other than Kentucky Educational Television's Renee Shaw. As KET's Director of Public Affairs, Renee is producer, managing editor, and host of KET's legislative coverage. Among her many responsibilities, Renee hosts Kentucky Tonight, Connections with Renee Shaw, and in June became host of yet another program. I encourage you to tune in to the new weekday series called Kentucky Edition. Renee, we will now turn over the reins to you, and we thank you. Let's thank them all for being here today.
Thank you, Joe, and it's indeed a pleasure to be here. And I thank the panel, who I know Morgan in particular had a long night or early morning. She's been up for a while, and so we appreciate her contribution today. So let's start with the Louisville mayor's race, and then we'll get to the state and the constitutional amendments that have failed. As Joe alluded to, Mayor-elect Craig Greenberg, and I'll start with you, Morgan, is going to be the mayor of Louisville. Interesting story that your colleague did that was posted online today, that he can serve no more than 2 consecutive terms. And that's thanks to a law that was passed by the General Assembly, House Bill 314, that changed that. So before we talk about that particular part, talk about the dynamics of the race and anything that was late breaking that it seemed to be, and as we discussed on KET for the last couple of nights, that Bill Diriff was really making some ground and it was closer than many people had anticipated. Is that a correct assessment from your view?
Yeah, I mean, hi. Yeah, definitely. I mean, if you look, the latest numbers that I saw this morning was Greenberg had 52% of the vote to Diriff's 46%. Compare that to Morgan McGarvey, who won with 62% of the vote. Clearly the mayor's race was a closer call. And I think that, when you looked at this, you had, Craig Greenberg running as a Democrat in Louisville, obviously a good thing if you want to win, that helps. But he was someone who didn't have past political experience. He was a businessman, had a lot of early support, especially financially, from some pretty notable people and families here in Louisville. But Bill Diriff really came in and focused on, hey, I have experience. I am currently the mayor of a city, albeit a smaller one than Louisville. And that was really a big part of his message. And I think if you look at the numbers, that seemed to resonate, even if it didn't quite get him over the top. Mm-hmm. Craig Greenberg dealt with a lot of like talk about, is he just going to be another Fisher? Although, as you pointed out, like he's not going to be able to serve for over a decade like Fisher did. But, you know, Craig Greenberg really focused on saying like, look, I'm my own man and I have a different vision for the city. Definitely like he and Deere both kind of talked pretty moderate on policing and talking about like wanting to, you know, fully fund the department and fix the, you know, low levels of hiring like of officers. Like they both kind of were on the same tack there. But at the end of the day, I don't know, you know, Louisville came out for the Democrat, which is what everyone expected. But yeah, I mean, for a city race, a lot closer than you might have guessed.
Yeah. Lawrence, you want to add to that?
Yeah, it's not surprising that Greenberg won, as Morgan said, because of Democratic registration in Louisville. But my first clue that this was going to be a tighter race than anyone expected was the fact that Greenberg was running attack ads against Deere late into this campaign. If you had a comfortable lead, you would ignore your opponent in your ads. But he was running those attack ads late, and that told me that this was going to be a closer race than anyone anticipated.
Yeah. Jacqueline, you have anything you'd like to add about the mayor's race?
I think there was a lot of good commentary on your program last night on KET that there was a lot of talk in this race about possibly wanting some change in Louisville, and that's why the Republican did get a little bit of traction, but I think that the other two have really covered it really well about Louisville is ready to stay in the Democratic category, but I think there could be some good new conversations that come out of this.
I will say this, Renee, this mayor's race is how a race should be run. They debated often, exchanged their views, were civil and cordial throughout the entire campaign, except for a few, attack ads, which we can expect. But this is the kind of campaign you like to see.
Right. And that's a whole nother maybe Louisville Forum about the importance of public debates, whether they're televised or not, and the participation of candidates in them. So, yeah, it was still a change election, right? Both candidates said that we can bring change. The major issues, of course, crime, the violent crime, education. What do we know about the kind of confidence that Mayor-elect Greenberg has in LMPD Chief Erica Shields?
It's a good question. Whenever he was asked about the chief, he would not commit to keeping or not keeping the chief. So we'll be watching early on to see what he does in that regard. He has talked about better training, increasing the numbers of police officers, but he's been non-committal about whether or not he'll keep the chief. So that's the first big decision. One of the first big decisions we're watching to see if he makes.
Yes, and your colleague wrote about a Louisville Department of Education. So can you expound on that concept?
So that was a big part of one of kind of the signature things that Greenberg proposed. To be clear, like what happens with JCPS is under the purview of the school board, which had its own run of elections last night, and all the incumbents won re-election that were up for a vote. So the city doesn't really control, what happens with JCPS, but Greenberg has talked about wanting to have what he kind of termed as like a small office that would look at trying to kind of play a role in, local discussions and work on education policy from, pre-kindergarten all the way through like the local colleges here in town, and kind of trying to maybe be have sort of a unifying look at those things. So we'll see what comes out of that. But yeah, don't expect him to come in and be able to, overhaul JCPS.
Sure, yeah, and not so much in his jurisdiction to be able to do that.
No,
right?
not at all.
So let's talk about the 3rd congressional district race with, I'm still going to call him senator, but he is now congressman-elect, and he's still a senator until January, right? And minority leader, just in case they go back into a special session for something. Morgan McGarvey, Stuart Ray, that race. I mean, this was kind of a foregone conclusion too, right? That Morgan was going to have that sewed up pretty tight.
No surprise at all. Morgan McGarvey is well known and well liked even among Republicans. Not necessarily liking his policies, but liking his personality and the way he goes about his business. So it was no surprise that he won that race handily.
Right. And Jacqueline, you've been around the state legislature for a long time. You've seen how still Leader McGarvey, as we'll call him, operates. And he has been bipartisan. He has a good relationship, I think, both personally and professionally with the Senate Majority Leader, Damon Thayer. At least they present that to be a fairly affable relationship. So you think he can transfer that same type type of attitude and bipartisan nature right to Washington.
I do. And during all of his acceptance speeches and interviews last night, you heard him say quite a bit about his experience in Frankfurt and how that will translate. Obviously, we've seen him work across the aisle quite a few times. He has made good relationships. I think he will carry that forward. Like you said, he's fun to be around. I think we all know that. He's a good person. And so I think that that definitely carries forward. I was interested to hear how much he actually really did talk about being in the legislature instead of Congress last night.
Right.
Everything he said dealt with his time in the legislature. Obviously, his time in the legislature has been successful for him, talking about how many bills he passed in a very small Democratic
18,
caucus.
although I think Bob Hellringer kind of snickered at that, but
Yeah,
that's Bob for
I
you.
was interested in that number too. But he has done a lot in his time in the legislature, built some good relationships, and I know he'll carry that forward. And that attitude is perfect, especially as we wait to see who controls Congress in the weeks moving forward. He needs to keep that attitude.
Yeah, and he's someone, if the House remains in Democratic control or returns at some point, he could be well positioned to be in a leadership role.
Exactly.
And that would be good on many fronts. Anything else you want to add about the 3rd District race?
We'll see about the leadership role thing. Congress is obviously a big,
Yeah,
big body,
right,
and there's
right.
a lot of people who've been there a long time.
That's right.
But certainly he's shown an ability to win over,
Yeah.
folks within and outside.
And
the
he's young
party.
enough where he can stay around.
Yes, definitely.
So that's the thing. He can certainly serve several terms if he so desires. So
I did notice last night, though, Bob Hellringer repeatedly talking about and bemoaning the fact that the Republicans in the State House did not redistrict that
Right.
district in order to add more Republicans. He thinks that cost him this race.
Because they've always just deferred to the incumbent, right, on redrawing those congressional boundaries. But they could have, since John Yarmouth was not seeking re-election, taken more liberty with that. But I've even heard, and I know you all have, Republican leaders say, but we didn't want to have to meet new people, right, and kind of curry along
Right.
others to our side. I mean, it is a lot of work. And then trying to, reformulate and make new relationships is tough, right?
Yeah, I spoke with Congressman Thomas Massey back when redistricting was happening, and he was like, look, I love my district. I like it the way it is. So yeah, I think you probably ran into quietly the congressmen themselves being like, we are happy.
Yeah, we're okay with how things are, right?
Outside of Comer, whose district changed
Well,
significantly.
yes, correct.
So I don't want to digress too much, but because we're all statewide, so we understand it. The 1st congressional district,
Yes.
I mean, what is that analogous to? I mean, it stretches far and
Very
wide,
far,
right?
yes, yes.
I mean, it's like you could get to almost Detroit faster. So it is interesting, and he, if the House flips, he's in line to become chair of the Oversight Committee, and he has said on numerous programs on KET that he is going to go after Dr. Fauci. He's going to try to, understand and probe the origins of COVID. And also, Hunter Biden is in his sights. And we know that if Senator Rand Paul, if the Senate flips, he's also in a position to probe Dr. Fauci some. So
In
just when
fact,
we
he
thought
said
that couldn't get any more interesting.
He said last night, welcome to Dr. Fauci's retirement party. So-
That's right. So a lot to keep our eyes on in Washington, and it's still unfolding because we know that Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, what's the 4th one, is still Nevada, thank you, is still undecided, or at least it was when I left Lexington at 10. So, that's a lot to keep our eyes on and how that will affect the balance of power and whether or not Mitch McConnell is the minority or majority leader. Anything you want to say about that?
Well, he's definitely looking like he's going to stay leader. I think there's like zero chance that the Republicans are going to say they don't want him as their party leader anymore. They're going to be voting on that soon now that the election's over. But yeah, I mean, he very commonly on the trail in Kentucky says it's better to be majority leader than minority leader, although both are good. So yeah, I'm sure he's absolutely watching that. His PACs affiliated with him put a lot of money into the Senate races to try to make this flip happen. So the whole country is watching.
Right.
And
I
I'm
mean,
sure, and this may again come down to Georgia, and I'm sure he's going to really hope and pray that Donald Trump stays out of it.
Yes.
right.
And his PAC will probably pour a lot of money into it to elect Herschel Walker, because it may come down to that one state.
Well, and we know that could be set for December 6th, right? And then when last I saw, it's like, points points difference. So we'll see how that goes. And even though former President Donald Trump had said, we don't want Mitch McConnell as Republican leader, then he's kind of backtracked on that in recent days. I mean, and McConnell has always been steadfast and kind of shrugs, right? He doesn't really give much oxygen to that.
Trump
And I
was never
think-
going to be able to get him out of the leadership job in the Senate. So.
And who's going to challenge Mitch McConnell for a leadership position? Rick Scott?
Rick Scott has been talked about, but I'd be very surprised if he did that.
Yeah. Okay, so now let's return back to the Kentucky legislature. We know that the House Democrats will start in the Kentucky House. They already had, Morgan, a very slim 25-member minority. Now it's shrunken even more, right? We just don't know by how much. I understand, just in a conversation I had in this room with Sean Southard, there could be some change in the District 88. So, those votes are still out there in Scott County because of redistricting. I mean, redistricting, Bob Babbage had a little lexicon for this last night. Redistricting, retirements, and Republican wave, and there's a fourth R that I can't remember, really kind of summarize what this contest was about on the state legislative level. So let's talk about some of these state races, particularly when we look at there's no Democrat in the House in the Central Time Zone anymore. And Republicans were able to make gains in Jefferson County, right? So we can't say that it's all Democrats owning urban areas, because that's not a true characterization.
No, absolutely not. Yeah, the Republicans made some notable wins in Jefferson County last night, and even Representative Jason Nemes was facing a challenge where his opponent, a Democrat, really focused on his votes on anti-abortion legislation. He won, so he's not gone. So, attempts to flip, seats like that didn't go for the Democrats, and Republicans had a good night in the legislature here.
But you look at people like Angie Hatton, who is the House Minority Whip, losing, this is House District 94 in Eastern Kentucky, Letcher County, and you think about all of the visuals of the floods, Lawrence, and she was a part of that. And I remember her recounting her stories of forming these human chains where they could rescue people. That just didn't stay in people's memory, I guess.
No, I mean, she's been very, very visible, especially during the floods. But let me go back to what you were talking about earlier. While it's true, Republicans did pick up some seats in the suburbs of Louisville, it does remain now that the Democrats in the state house are going to be from Louisville and Lexington.
Well, that's right, yes.
The rural areas are now all Republican. So Bowling Green, that is now Republican. And you mentioned Angie Hatton. The seat in Northern Kentucky is also
Buddy Wheatley's
Buddy
seat.
Wheatley. So it's even more of an urban-rural divide.
Right.
In the state house.
The only surviving House Democrat was Ashley Tackett Lafferty.
Right.
Which I believe puts two Democrats left in Eastern Kentucky, the other one being Robin Webb.
Being Robin Webb, who's in the other chamber.
Yes, exactly.
Right? Who is a very moderate
Yes.
Democrat. And I think the point was made by our good friend Bob Heller
Yes.
that if Democrats ran more Robin Webb-like candidates, they might be able to chip away at some of these supermajorities. Do you think that's true?
Absolutely, and especially the way that Robin operates. In that area, people like a bold, outspoken person to represent them. Robin is definitely that, and she has opinions kind of, if you will, on both sides of the aisle.
Right.
Especially in these urban or these rural areas, we've seen a lot of blue dog Democrats over the years. People who were still registered Democrat but really voted Republican. We've seen that now very much shift. They are Republicans voting Republican, and so there are very few left in these rural areas, and I don't see that changing anytime soon. Obviously, redistricting played a part in all of this, but at the same time, it's really just what's happening in this state. Yeah. But, and I know we'll talk about the amendments, there's very interesting dynamics between those things in terms of what people want and even the primaries versus now. So a lot of the primaries were focused on Liberty candidates. Now, I don't think there were that many this time. Jay Williams, maybe, but as was discussed on your show last night, he's kind of evolved over the last couple of years. But it was really just establishment Republicans last night who really saw a lot of victories in all areas across the state.
Right. Although those Liberty candidates in northern Kentucky
Still gonna be in the
they're still going to be in the
legislature. Yes,
legislature.
they are still
right,
gonna be in the
because they didn't have any contest in the general.
Yes.
Okay, so we talked about some of those things. Anything else on the state Senate and state House?
Well, the state Senate, you have to acknowledge Karen Berg winning big in her race.
Right.
People may not remember, not long ago, that was represented by a longtime Republican, Ernie Harris. And now that district seems to be solidly Democratic,
Right.
electing her by a wide margin in that race.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to go now. Joe Arnold.
Thank you. And we also have a request from the back of the room. If you could really go on top of those microphones, that would help to be able to hear in the back. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask 3 questions in a row, and then maybe each of you can choose which one you want to answer. And Renee, it's up to you to decide who's going to answer what. But they all have to do with abortion. What role did the abortion issue play in the Louisville mayor's race? That's one question. With the defeat of the proposed Amendment 2 in line with polling on the same issue, do you expect legislators to actually follow the will of the people or continue to further their own agendas? So number 2 question is, what's going to happen in Frankfort? And the third question actually is right in line with that, but I'm going to read it for context. Now that it appears question 2, abortion amendment, has failed, but Republicans have an even bigger supermajority, what legislation do you anticipate? So mayor's race, and then what to expect in Frankfort as a result of what happened yesterday.
Okay. You want to take the first one about the mayor's race and the impact of the abortion?
Sure. I mean, I think it definitely had to have some kind of impact. I was talking with our columnist, Joe Girth, last night when the results were still coming in. And at that moment, Amendment 2, the no vote here in Jefferson County was like 111,000 votes more than the yes side, which he said was like the biggest margin that we'd seen here on a single ballot question ever. So clearly, like, people in Jefferson County came out big for the abortion rights side of that amendment. And you did see, talk about abortion in the mayor's race. The mayor has not much control at all over abortion policy, but, Craig Greenberg really emphasized, I am an abortion rights candidate. I'll do whatever I can to reflect that in my limited power as mayor. And he went after Deeriff, painting Deeriff as someone who people couldn't trust if they cared about abortion rights, which, to be fair, is something Deeriff really pushed back against. But that may have made a difference for folks when especially if they're coming in really fired up to vote no on 2.
Yeah. Question number 2, Jacqueline, do you want to take that
Yes.
about what Frankfort may do? And does the polling, I think, line up with how the actual outcome of the constitutional amendment number 2?
I'd love to talk about that. So there's a lot of interesting things that happened with both amendments. First of all, when I was coming here today, I looked at the turnout numbers. Obviously, we know turnout was huge, 50% around, I believe, that Mike Adams was saying last night. I looked at the U.S. Senate race and then constitutional amendment 2. A little bit more voted in the U.S. Senate race, potentially, but not much at all compared to Amendment 2. So that was a huge vote getter. So when you think about why our turnout was so big, it clearly drove people to the polls. So that's the first thing. That's incredibly interesting because this is all we've heard about for so long is this issue, but they rejected it. And it wasn't really that close. It's in the 50s compared to the 40s in terms of final vote. So I think it changes their narrative quite a bit. Not only do I think it changes what happens in Frankfort, I think it changes the governor's race too. I think this is going to they're going to have to evaluate their talking points because right now all they're talking about is pro-life, pro-Kentucky. You haven't heard them drive an agenda, any of the candidates yet, especially on the Republican side. So it has a lot to do with it. And I'll let Lawrence definitely answer what bills might come out of this. But I do think that they're going to, I don't see them backing off, honestly. I do think that it continues to be a staple of what they're talking about, but it's clearly a rejection of the totality of doing away with this issue. They wanted to put it to bed, no matter what. You cannot deal with this issue, and the voters said no. So I think that has to change them in some ways, and I think it has a lot of ripple effect going into 2023 in multiple different ways, whether that's the legislature or the governor's race. I think, as state political observers, it's really interesting because this is one of the years where we don't fully know what they're going to do in Frankfort. I'm sure this is going to come up again, but it's probably not going to be the main focus. So then what is? But also, real quick on the amendments too, I want to say that this is going to change their attitudes quite a bit on constitutional amendments moving forward, I think. The fact that both of their priorities failed is a huge thing, even with super majorities. So the people in their areas are electing them, but they're not voting for what they want. So that has to be a wake-up call. But at the same time, the last constitutional amendment that passed and was successful was Marcy's Law, and we still saw problems there. Right. But that was a huge campaign around that with a lot of money, so that proves to them, it should at least, that you have got to put money behind these campaigns. You have to be organized. And the only organization and money that we did see was from the no side of Constitutional Amendment 2. And it still was late in the game, but you even saw a lot of articles about, the Republican legislature tried to counter misinformation about Constitutional Amendment 2 and created more confusion. So there was no real organization on the yes side of that at all, and that clearly proved to be a problem. So they have to reevaluate as we talk about things like local taxes moving forward that would require a constitutional amendment. They have to really take a good look at that moving forward.
Yeah, and we've seen that's gotten stuck on
Yes,
that, on
exactly.
more options for local government. So I want to go to Morgan real quick before I go to Lawrence on that, because they did pass an omnibus House Bill 3. Right, this was by Nancy Tate, who's from Brandenburg, and this dealt with medication-assisted abortion. It dealt with judicial bypass. I mean, it is what it says. It was omnibus, so that is still law. And so, what could their other options be? And we have to also say that the Kentucky Supreme Court, not coincidentally, is going to be hearing a lawsuit on November 15th, which is this coming Tuesday or next Tuesday.
Yeah, I mean. If Amendment 2 had been adopted, that would have essentially basically tied the state Supreme Court's hands and been like, nope, we've decided that there isn't a right to abortion. So in this case, the voters basically said, well, the U.S. Supreme Court remanded the question of abortion laws down to the states, which makes state court decisions vitally important to what happens with abortion laws. And the people decided, we're not going to tie the court's hands in this way. We want to, we're going to see what the courts decide without us telling them, what we think is or isn't in the Constitution. I think that's a big deal. I do think at the same time, you do still have supermajorities, many very strong anti-abortion politicians like Nancy Tate. So I think you're absolutely going to see some form of anti-abortion legislation introduced next year. I do think this will affect the discussions. I saw polling. I'm not privy to a lot of any of the private polling that may have been done on people's views on abortion during the No on 2 campaign, but I saw some polling from earlier this summer that did indicate that Kentuckians had some, still largely way more anti-abortion views than most states, but they were, there was a majority of the Kentuckians polled saying, we want exceptions for rape and incest. We want exceptions that are currently not in the ban that we have in this state. So I'll be interested to see if that changes the conversation around that at all.
But you know that during this most recent session, Rachel Roberts, who survived a challenge last night, had proposed an amendment to House Bill 3 that I think even a procedural snafu even kept it from being considered, right? So even though the public says we may want exceptions for rape and incest, it doesn't seem to be that those who are representing the public feel the same.
Highly doubtful that the Republican supermajorities would come in and edit the trigger ban in that way. But certainly now they have a direct line to what Kentuckians are thinking on this, at least on some aspect, which we didn't necessarily have before.
Right. Lawrence.
So much to say here. First of all, full disclosure, the Kentucky Baptist Convention was one of those advocating for the passage of Amendment 2, but the yes side was outspent 10-1. That was part of it. But I think a big part of the reason this was defeated was, believe it or not, the Dobbs decision. Mm-hmm. I think the Dobbs decision, which overturned Roe v. Wade, energized the other side, one, and two, caused some people who may have been pro-life in theory to wonder if they're pro-life in reality, if that makes sense.
It does.
So I thought that, combined with the fact that there was a lot of money spent and there was confusion as to what the amendment would or would not do, or was part of it, But there's an interesting dynamic here because although the amendment was defeated, Kentuckians still elected pro-life Republicans to the legislature. So it is still a pro-life legislature. It will be interesting to see if, I'm sure there will be an attempt to add exceptions to the current law, but it'll be interesting to see if there are any, it gets any traction in light of what happened with Amendment 2.
Right.
And Renee, real quick, in terms of laws they might consider, from the Kentucky Chamber side of things, obviously we're monitoring other states, seeing legislatures try and challenge a private corporation's decisions on what they cover in their plans. So if you've seen a lot of Amazons and people like that say, we'll cover it if you need to go to a different state, we'll cover your travel and things like that. If you want to get an abortion, it's illegal in your state. A lot of legislatures are dealing with that. Obviously, the Kentucky Chamber does not have an opinion on this issue whatsoever, but that when you get involved in employer rights is definitely something that we're watching as well. And we've gotten to the point, again, to your point about the omnibus bill, there's not much more you can do at this point, but that's the type of thing we are watching very closely to see if they do start to poke into that type of area.
Right, yeah, and we'll see because season for pre-filing is now,
Yes.
right? Any other comment? Yeah, Morgan.
Another thing to watch based on what you're seeing lawmakers across the state, some lawmakers propose is there's a lot of talk about whether or not the next step, when you have almost completely banned abortion in Kentucky, we'll see what happens with the Supreme Court case that's coming up post-election, is the idea of going after restrictions on certain forms of contraception, emergency contraception like Plan B being one of them, IUDs as well, intrauterine devices, and then talks about certain fertility treatments as well. We'll be looking to see if any legislation proposing such restrictions is proposed. I know talking to, a couple of lawmakers who've supported anti-abortion legislation, they said, they don't want to go after fertility treatments, and I don't know about emergency contraception. We will see on that, but that certainly would be an incredibly controversial thing to pursue.
Yeah, and I think Adia Wishner, who is head of the Kentucky Right to Life, has said that there was not intention to go after IVF and those types of fertility treatments. So we'll see if that.
Bottom line, Renee, even with the Amendment 2's defeat, abortion remains illegal in Kentucky. The law is in effect.
Right.
There'll be a hearing before the state Supreme Court next week. And Daniel Cameron is going to argue that regardless of this vote, there is no stated right to abortion in the state constitution. That's going to be his argument. Of course, the other side will oppose that, but it'll come down to what the Supreme Court decides to do. And that ruling won't come for several months.
That's right.
And the question will also have to decide is whether, while they're making this decision, does the law stay in effect, or do they allow the law to go into effect while the decision is being made? A lot of dynamics still left in this question in Kentucky.
Right, and that hearing is going to be Tuesday, we believe at 10 a.m. Regardless of what time it is, you can watch it online, ket.org, and it will be on our Kentucky channel. We know that there'll be some legislative hearings, but I've made the decision that this is important, so that we should go ahead and broadcast that out statewide. So we will cover that. Good, Morgan?
I'm happy about that.
Okay. And an interesting also side note about that is that although this wouldn't affect the actual maybe decision, but in the Kentucky Supreme Court race, and then I'm going to come to you, Joe. I'm sorry, I get on a roll on this stuff, and there's no stopping me. The Kentucky Supreme Court race, where you had Justice Michelle Keller, this is the 6th District, Northern Kentucky area, who was up against the architect and author of the trigger law and the constitutional amendment, Joe Fisher. She was able to defeat him last night. So that could have some bearing on when they do issue a ruling, which could be several months from the time they hear that case next Tuesday.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it's interesting, I think, when you look at it, that both Amendment 2 and then the race for that particular Supreme Court race where anti-abortion issues were absolutely a part of that. In both cases, Kentuckians pushed back against the idea, against the anti-abortion side specific to the judiciary. And right now, the state judiciary is more important than ever on what happens with abortion laws in this state. So yeah, Fisher losing is a big deal for, that could have affected future Supreme Court decisions because he was so clearly an anti-abortion candidate.
Right.
And speaking of judges, we should note Philip Shepard won his race
Right.
in Frankfurt, in
Pretty
Franklin
decidedly.
Circuit Court. Yes.
Yes, because that race seemed to, I mean, I saw those ads and it looked like it could have been tighter, but it wasn't. Joe.
I wanted to ask this question before you moved off of abortion. Given the failure of Trump-endorsed candidates and anti-abortion measures across the country, is Daniel Cameron now in worse shape in the governor's race next year?
Good question. Who wants to take a crack at that one first?
I can start real quick. And kind of what I said earlier, I think that all of them now have to reevaluate what their platform is. Obviously, Daniel Cameron has been very strong about where he stands on this, but he has to come up with some other things. Clearly, voters want to hear other things from you at this point. And I know we're very early in this race, but they have all got to come up with their platforms and how they're going to improve Kentucky. Especially, I think that it's more important than ever as we see other states growing at a very rapid rate, bringing new people into the state. Is going to be an important thing to talk about. I haven't heard any of them really talk about an agenda, and not to bring him up, but Matt Bevin, had a blueprint for a better Kentucky. These people have had plans on how they want to improve the state. We haven't heard much of that. We've just heard we want to fight for Kentucky kids and, that kind of thing. So I do think that all of them have to take a really hard look at what they're talking about, what their platform is. But also in terms of him, I think they are all kind of on the same page. While he has been out in front more because of his position, they all have been pretty strong on this issue.
Well, I was going to say, there's
Yeah,
not much
also-
daylight in these candidates who are running for the
Yeah.
Republican primary for Governor Lawrence. I mean, they all say that they're pro-life.
Yeah, that's not going to be a major factor. I mean, the fact is Kentucky is still a pro-life state, judging by the way they vote for their candidates. So that still resonates outside the Louisville area in the rest of the state. And also, as far as Trump, it doesn't really matter to Cameron how Trump does outside of Kentucky, just that he remains popular in Kentucky. That's the big key to that.
And he's changed his endorsement before, too, just to put that out there, too. So you never know. That could happen as well.
Right. Which many people were expecting when Kelly Craft,
Exactly.
Former UN ambassador and to Canada as well, but that didn't happen then. So we'll still keep our eyes on that. Anything you want to add to that, Morgan, before we move on?
No, I mean, he made a great point. I mean, I haven't seen anything so far to suggest that Trump has become suddenly unpopular in this state. So I'm sure having a thumbs up from him matters, particularly to voters in the Republican, a certain segment of voters anyway, in the Republican primary that he's going to have to win to go up against Bashir.
Joe.
Because you're talking Donald Trump, I'm going to go ahead and ask two more Trump questions. And I always read them, by the way, in full, so just bear with me. Do you think Trump's ostensible power is much diminished? Who cares what he thinks anymore? And then secondly, is the Trump subpoena with the current Congress now over?
Well,
That second
let
one,
me,
the first one.
the first part of that, and I answered earlier, I think Trump is diminished in certain parts of the country where he endorsed weak candidates who lost their races. But it remains to be seen whether or not he has lost any impact in Kentucky. It doesn't seem to be the case at this moment, but it depends. A lot can happen in a couple of years, so you never know. And these subpoenas and these court cases that he's now facing could play a role in that. If Republicans take control of the House, it could very well mean the end of the January 6th committee. So I suspect they'll come out with a report before the Congress changes and give Trump time to stall. He'll have time to stall before he responds and has to testify before the committee.
As for his influence, I mean, I think there's no question that when you go from being president to not being president, your influence has diminished. Like, your power is less and your influence is less than when you were president. But clearly still a big player in the Republican Party and in politics, although last night, Governor Ron DeSantis in my home state of Florida absolutely wrecked the competition and won re-election, and he has been floated as a 2024 presidential candidate, someone that Trump has recently been kind of trying to warn off, but coming off a hot win like that, clearly Trump is not the only star in the GOP right now, nationally.
Yeah, I'd say DeSantis was the big winner last night, and Trump probably a loser.
Well, especially when you look at who he endorsed and who won. So you look at these big races that we were all watching, Dr. Oz and, Herschel Walker, those type of things. He was pretty involved in those races, but those are the ones that didn't quite go so well, whereas Republican governors won by a landslide in most states who were not Trump-type candidates in most situations. So I believe Scott Jennings tweeted this morning, most of us know Scott Jennings, he's a CNN contributor too, said, how can you look at those results and think that Trump could win in 2024? So that's a very interesting take on that. I do think that I know that he's supposed to make an announcement next Tuesday. Right. I'm assuming that's about 2024 and him getting in the race. But I do think that people are probably starting to wane a little bit. Obviously, I think that a lot of even when we talk about the primaries in the state house races and the Liberty candidates, a lot of that was driven by kind of Trump narrative, especially around the pandemic. That stuff has died down. A lot of these things that got people really fired up died down. And so it will be interesting. Like Lauren said, there's a lot that can happen over the next couple of years, but it'll be interesting to see, especially if he continues on this trajectory, if he would have any chance.
And continuing on what you said about the dynamic of the 2020 pandemic, there's a lot of people were fired up about JCPS in particular and the schools shutting down, but yet all the incumbents in the school board won their races. That's interesting.
What would explain that?
If I could, I wouldn't be sitting here. I'd be making a lot of money as a consultant. I don't know.
I mean, the 4 people who won the school board races are incumbents.
Right.
So I mean, the fact that they won, like you do, of course, like have an incumbent advantage, but also, I mean, people decided to stick with the folks who have been running JCPS. Definitely a defeat for some conservative parents who got really politically active and raised a lot of complaints about JCPS handling of the pandemic and other issues. So I mean, yeah, a big deal, and one where you did see across the country, you've seen outside spending by conservative groups trying to impact school policy making and school board races, particularly around issues like remote learning, masking in schools, how race is taught in schools. But here, the political arm of the teachers union absolutely was the big spender in these school board races. We did not see a commensurate amount of money coming out of the, conservative, challenging side.
We have 2 more questions about the national election and your analysis of why it turned out this way. I'm going to read them sequentially here. Do you think the lack of a so-called red wave on a national level shows the impact of purposeful redistricting, gerrymandering, that results in the super duper majority? I think I have that right. And then the second one is, can a Republican win countrywide, or is the brand too bad? So 2 questions there, Renee, you can allocate.
Okay, so let's start with that first one about the Republican wave in Kentucky, because I think a Republican wave is still being determined whether on the national level, right? But let's start there and redistricting. I got this question a lot on air last night. You know how you get responses to your coverage as you're doing it. And many people suggested that the reason why Republicans were so strong last night was because of redistricting mostly. And had that exercise not happened, those victories would have been a lot slimmer. I don't know.
Redistricting definitely has an impact. Forgive me, I'm not, it's been a little while. It was earlier this year that I was really deep in redistricting, so I don't quite remember. But I mean, Republicans were in charge of redistricting in some key nationwide races for Congress, although, of course, Democrats got their fair share, too. For example, in Florida, DeSantis's involvement in redistricting was a big deal and is something people are pointing to as a factor in why Republicans had an absolutely insanely good night in Florida, in a state that when I was growing up was absolutely a swing state. But I think what I have seen reports of nationally is that there was this talk of if there was going to be a huge red wave where the Republicans would just come in and by the end of the night they'd have these really significant, House majority, they'd maybe win the Senate. And we definitely didn't see that. Republicans might still win the House and the Senate, but if they do, it's not to the degree that people thought they would, particularly in the House. And I have seen, a lot of, obviously, we're still like kind of Wednesday morning quarterbacking all this, but I think it's probably pretty clear that the Dobbs decision overturning Roe v. Wade had to have some level of impact on that. I mean, that's just a singular event in this country's history, a nearly 50-year-old right being eliminated. And absolutely people showed up to vote on that. And I'm sure that did maybe swing some tight races and maybe diminished that expected red wave.
I think in Kentucky, redistricting was really interesting this year. This was the first time that the House was able to make their own maps. It's the first time that Republicans have had control when redistricting happened. Obviously, we saw them be successful in a lot of rural areas where they got their people in. They redistricted in a way, but also a lot of that has to do with population. But I do want to point out that in the primaries, they lost 3 of their chairmen after redrawing their own map. So there's still going to be Republicans in those seats, but that is a really interesting side effect of redistricting as well, at least in Kentucky. I'm sure that happens some across the nation too. I think last night, again, like I said, is kind of more establishment Republicans in these rural areas, but the primaries, I mean, that was a big blow to them, and it's going to have major consequences. Those are 3, again, chairmen who have carried a lot of bills multiple times. So I think it will change the narrative in the state as well. In terms of the second part of the question about whether a Republican can win, I think there's still so much to see it. I think it depends on who the Republican is. I think last night showed that it's really going to be issues focused moving forward. They rejected parts. Again, I think that the abortion stuff really had to do with some of this turnout and some of these election results. But it's going to depend on Joe Biden. I know that we all see headlines all the time about him messing up during his speeches and what his approval rating is, things like that. So it would depend on who the Republican is, how extreme they are, and what the appetite for that is at the time, I think.
When it comes to redistricting, I'm back to the state map. The bottom line is if you hold supermajorities, you get to make the rules.
Right.
I have been around long enough to remember when the Democrats were the supermajority and Republicans were complaining about redistricting. So now it's flipped to the other side. If you have that many seats in both houses, then you can draw the maps to your advantage. And who knows, one day it may flip again someday. So that's just the nature of the political beast.
And there's not much appetite for an independent third-party commission to draw legislative boundaries, right?
Doesn't appear so. And to the question about is the Republican Party's brand too bad to win a presidency? I mean, I don't see that. I was listening to a podcast this week about 2013 after the 2012 election, and they did this autopsy of the GOP, this sense that basically President Obama and that we were just going to see Democrats winning nationally in perpetuity. And then Donald Trump won. And then, the 2020 race, Joe Biden won, but it was competitive. And we're sitting here debating whether or not it's very possible the Republicans will win control of potentially both chambers of Congress this time around. There's still, influence there. There was this sense that demographics are destiny, the idea that the country is getting less white would mean that Republicans were done for. And we haven't seen that. It's clear that Democrats can't just count on black voters, voters of color across the board to just vote Democrat. They're having to put in a lot more work. So yeah, I mean, I think it doesn't really seem, based on what we're seeing in the country, that you can sound the death knell for the GOP. Far from it. And
especially real quick, last night, a lot of the national polling showed that the number one issue was inflation. So it's still the economy stupid, as they say. So, and that typically comes back to Republicans. People are worried about the economy. They're worried about the track that we're on. They're worried about a recession, those type of things. And typically, when you look at it from a history standpoint, when people are worried about those things, they tend to vote to the right.
And one last thing regarding whether a Republican can win a national race, I agree totally with what Jacqueline said, is that it depends on who it is, who the candidate is. I think one reason that the Republican wave didn't occur last night because there were so many bad candidates. That was part of the issue.
Candidate quality matters. We've heard that before, right? Joe, if you want to go, I was going to talk about
go for it.
Constitutional Amendment number 1, because we've overlooked that also went down in defeat, and that would have allowed the leadership essentially to call the General Assembly into special session, and it would terminated those end dates of March 30th and April 15th, whether it was an even or an odd year. And what did you think of that, Morgan? I mean, did that line up with what you were hearing or polling? Any polling done about that before?
I didn't see polling, but I absolutely expected that to fail. Partly, Amendment 2 sucked up all the air in the room, y'all. Like, come on. That's what people were talking about. And you didn't have the kind of money going into the Amendment 1 race, as pointed out earlier. I also think you probably had some voters, I'm sure plenty of voters knew what it was, and voted no accordingly, because they didn't like the idea of that, of giving government more power, right? I think there's definitely a libertarian streak among some Kentucky voters who may not have liked that, but I'm sure plenty of people walked in, took one look at that long thing, said, I don't know what this is, but I'm not adding that to the Constitution, and just voted no, because if you don't know, say no,
Right.
I think voters are generally, and there are exceptions, of course, Marcy's Law was one. I think voters generally loathe to change the Constitution.
Right. But they did with Marcy's Law.
Yeah, that was an
But
exception.
that was a huge campaign, and
That's right.
it was a very emotional issue too.
Right, that's true. And so why didn't we see that kind of education campaign for Constitutional Amendment number 1?
And that is definitely a question for the legislators, because first of all, if you look at the turnout numbers again, far less people voted for or in that amendment at all than they did for Amendment 2, significantly less people. But at the same time, I think they really confused people with Amendment 1. A lot of people thought, okay, so they're just allowed to call themselves in whenever. Well, I still think the governor should be able to call them in well, they still could, but you confused them. You confused people too much, and it was way too long compared to Amendment 2, which was this much, and it was on the back. So it was just not well planned in any way, no money behind it. And even if they had, I go back to Amendment 2, and I remember an op-ed that was written by 2 male legislators that said, put reproductive rights back where it belongs in the hands of the legislature, which I don't know who's advising them on, but as a communications professional, that was not it.
Well, that's kind of what Dr. Oz said during the debate with Fetterman, that it belongs in the medical providers, the women, and politicians.
Right. So to Morgan's
similar.
point, both of those amendments said give us more power, and the voters said no.
Right. And so we should note that both of those amendments were passed by the General Assembly in 2021. CA1 got to Secretary Adams' desk first, and that's why it was placed first on the ballot. I do wonder if ballot positioning might have changed the outcome of CA2.
I have no, I feel like there was a lot of well put out there info about it though, but maybe, I don't know. I will say I cover politics full time, and I had to read Amendment 1 multiple times to make sure I understood what it was going to do. So imagine.
And you'd written about it.
Right. Yeah. I'm saying okay, I've got this. Right. So yeah, regular voters who aren't paid to focus on this stuff.
Right. Yeah.
We talked a lot about the Republicans. We have a couple questions about the Democratic Party in Kentucky. After a huge loss last night across the state and not supporting Charles Booker enough with money, per his statement this morning, does the Democratic Party need to rethink things in Kentucky? And follow-up question is, do the Democrats, I think from an earlier question about a bench, do the Democrats really have a bench of candidates in Kentucky is the question. So there's 2 things there, Renee.
Let's take that last one first. I won't answer, but I do have an answer. But I'm not here to answer. I'm here to pose the questions.
You could give us a little bit. They definitely don't have as deep a bench as the Republicans. No question. The Republicans have coming up on 80 people in the House compared to, way, way, way less Democrats. So, and that's traditionally where you would see a bench be built is, in the legislature and things like that. I will say that you do, see Emerge Kentucky is out there kind to kind of train people up to get into public office. So I think there are efforts around that, but there's a lot of ground to try to make up on that front, especially if you're looking to build the bench in rural areas specifically.
But the failure for the Democrats not to field a viable candidate for the 6th congressional district and a less progressive candidate for U.S. Senate. I mean, is that not a reflection of Governor Andy Beshear or the head of the Democratic Party?
That's the thing. There's still room for Democrats in this state, but you have to be a moderate Democrat at this point. You can't be extreme on either side of things. And last night showed you can't really be that extreme on the other side either, or the voters will reject that too. So I think that there is still room. And the 6th congressional district is exactly right. I mean, that was way closer than it should have been for someone who's run for office multiple times to no avail at all. And he wasn't Jeff Young wasn't supported by the governor or anyone, and still got way more votes than anyone would have expected him to. So especially with something like Amendment 2 on the ballot, if somebody like an Amy McGrath had been on the ballot this time, because that still remains the only district that could swing in terms of congressional. Obviously, Lexington is in there, so that's why. But it is the failure of the Democrats. They'd have to look at, and Bob Hellringer talked about this a lot last night. He's clearly a big Robin Webb fan, but Robin Webb is the type of person you have to recruit if you're going to be successful as a Democrat in this state anymore. You can't be too focused on a lot of these other issues. And while Booker, I think, inspired hope in a lot of people, it's still too far left for the rest of the state. And I think that's really important for everyone to consider moving forward.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, Charles Booker is a very charismatic man, good campaigner, but he ran a deep blue campaign in a deep red state, and it didn't work. He thought he could the Hood to the Holler campaign would bring people in rural areas who faced many of the same issues as people in West Louisville do, would bring them to him, but they did not. So yeah, the Democrats are going to have to kind of examine the candidates they run, and I'm interested in seeing what Charles Booker does next. He has a lot of support in Louisville, so he could win almost any race, I think, in the urban area.
I do. In terms of the idea of did him being progressive tank his chances against Senator Rand Paul? I question whether any Democrat right now could win a statewide, national, congressional race. I mean, Amy McGrath ran as a moderate Democrat. I mean, she was the moderate candidate, and Senator Mitch McConnell stomped her. I mean, it was like 20 points, and that was running that kind of a campaign, although there were definitely some pretty significant gaffes in that campaign as well. So I think that I do question that. And as far as the deep bench goes, I do think you have a good point about candidates, like competitive candidates, not being fielded. I know that we saw that in quite a few races for State House and Senate where there just wasn't a competitor from the Democrats. So that's a lot of bench building that needs to happen. But also I think it might be hard to get people running for public offices a lot. And I'm sure there's plenty of people who look at, Andy Barr survived a couple, significant challenges to his campaign. Do I really want to run just to lose? Almost definitely, So I think that that's a challenge for them too, is finding people willing to run what's in a lot of cases going to feel like a losing campaign from the start.
2-minute warning, so last questions, and we'll stick with the Democratic Party, or at least in some regard. Morgan, I think both of these are for you. With 46% of the vote for Greenberg, does that signal a large dissatisfaction with Democratic control of the mayor's office over the last 12 years? They're also asking if you can preview who will serve on Greenberg's transition team.
I think the fact that Greenberg only won by the latest numbers being about 6%, certainly it's a lot closer than you'd expect. And we were talking about this in the newsroom last night about, Fisher. I haven't seen specific numbers, but Fisher having a lot of popularity problems in this city amongst, across the spectrum, really politically. I'm sure that had an impact when you're looking for, fresh blood and thinking, well, the last Democrat, I'm not happy with what he's been doing. Do I want to send another one there? But clearly people decided they did. As far as his transition team, my colleague Billy Coben did an interview with him this morning that I haven't gotten a chance to watch yet. So maybe check the Courier-Journal website and he might have gotten an answer on that. I can't tell you guys that yet, but it's going to be something I'm looking for, and I'm sure you all are over the next month or so to see who he officially kind of names.
Renee Shaw, Jacqueline Pitts, Morgan Watkins, Lawrence Smith from the back of the room. Thank you so much for today. Our next Louisville Forum is December 14th. Have a good afternoon.